All right, welcome. We should be live here on Twitch and YouTube. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes to see if we can let some people in. But if you are joining us here in the chat, please say hi. Please let me know where you're watching from. Let me know if you've been up to anything interesting lately. I'm on my second cup of coffee today. It may not be my last because I am presenting tonight to the San Francisco Java user group at their time. I think, what time is it? Their time is 6:30, so my time is 9:30. Not as adventurous as some of the presentations that my coworker Josh Long does, but still 9:30 with kids sleeping should be an interesting one. But that is what I'm prepping for. And that's what we're going to do today. So we'll get into, I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do. And like I said, if you're here, just go ahead and say hi and let me know where you're watching from. So today we're talking about what's new in Spring Boot 2.6. So that is the presentation that I'm giving tonight. We're going to take a look at the release notes. And, so I've only had a few days to really kind of prep for this because I gave a presentation last Wednesday. That's kind of what I was doing. I was in training a lot of last week. I had Monday off. So I've been kind of the last few days just kind of diving into this. And one thing that I can say is this has been kind of an eye-opening experience of just another great resource to learn Spring Boot. And I've kind of always known this, but I just haven't really dove into the release notes. Spencer's here. Hey, Spencer, thanks for joining us. Yeah, so the release notes, I've kind of always taken an approach of the release notes, like I'd be like, oh, there's a new version of Spring Boot out. Let me see what's kind of new. And I just kind of glanced through the release notes and see if anything really stuck out to me. And if those things stuck out to me, then I would kind of dive in further, right? But I never took the time to go by each one and make sure I really understood what the change was or what the new addition was. And with this one, I did. I really had to understand each of, well, first off, not every single one, but kind of the highlights, right? I really had to dive in and understand each of the new features. So I just feel like what I want to do now is go back, and I did this with 2.4. I think I've got a pretty good handle on what was new in 2.4. Didn't really do this with 2.5 or 2.3. Kind of did this with 2.0. So I think as part of my just trying to understand Spring as much as I can, I'm going to go back and do the same thing that I did with the 2.6 release notes and really spend some time learning previous versions of release notes. So I think another video I want to put together is just kind of free resources, ways that you can learn Spring Boot. And for me, number one is the docs. Number two are the guides that are put together over on spring.io. And now number three for me is the release notes, because you incrementally get to understand what went into a release, what changed, what got deprecated, what the motivations were behind those changes. So, Sweet Killer 9, the peace up. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I think those three resources together are really great, and they're all free. So, three of my recommended ways to get up to date on what's new in spring. Again, if you're just joining us, say hi. Let me know where you're from. Let me know if you've been up to anything interesting lately. I know I'm outside of Cleveland, Ohio. We had some interesting weather this week, as a normal Cleveland week goes. It was 60 degrees on Monday, rainy on Tuesday, and snowing today. So typical Cleveland weather. We kind of saw it all, and I'm sure we'll get more snow as the week goes on. I'm looking forward to. I kind of mark this down in my calendar every year, which is March 13th this year, when we spring ahead, and we spring the clocks ahead for those not in the U.S. Yeah, and once that happens, for me, it just kind of stays light out longer, and I know that like summer's kind of almost here, even though we may still get some more snow. It kind of just kind of signals in my head like, oh, we're almost through this. Hi from Germany. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's get going here. Let's share my screen. And we'll share this one. And again, this is really going to be interactive. This is not the presentation I'm giving tonight, so there'll be some code snippets involved that we're going to use tonight. But if you want to see the full presentation with slides and the exact timeline that we're going to go through, and you're signed up to visit the San Francisco Java user group tonight, please stay signed up. This is really just a kind of hacking session to hack on some code and make sure I have everything figured out for what I want to talk about tonight. And we'll just go for a while. Usually this is 1 to 2 hours, but wherever, as long as people are sticking around, we can sit here and hack at some code. So the first thing that we're going to do is I don't have a Git repository ready for tonight. That is one of the main objectives of this, is we're going to go through and do a lot of the code that I want to show in this presentation. And I need to get a Git repository up and running on github.com/Dan Vega. So that is my GitHub account. If you're not familiar with it, take a look at it. And that's kind of main goal number one. Goal number two is to kind of just go through some of these release notes and really figure out what I want to show in this presentation, which I have an idea of. So normally live coding, I want to go in and just kind of not have an idea, but today I have a little bit of an idea since I had to prep for a presentation. So here are the release notes. We're not going to go through these one by one together in the release notes format. Again, I kind of want to go through in a code format and talk about them. So I have some notes over here on another screen, which I will kind of go by. And actually, maybe I will have to show some slides. I don't know, we'll see. Let's start with, because this is a slide, I don't want to show this one in there. So the release notes for Spring Boot are usually broken up into two sections. The first section is you're upgrading from a previous version of Spring Boot, most likely the last major version of Spring Boot, right? So in this case, this is 2.6. Here are some notes about things that you're going to encounter if you're just trying to upgrade your 2.5 app. Now, if you're upgrading from 2.4, 2.3, 2.0, this is where you'd want to look through past release notes to get this similar upgrade path. If you just try to go from 2.0 to 2.6, there's going to be more than this. You could just try it and try to fix errors as you go, but these release notes will really kind of give you an idea of things that you might run into. So again, this is not something we're going to code, but one thing to think about is how deprecated features work in Spring Boot. So when a major feature is deprecated for removal, it's going to be removed 2 versions later. So that means now that we're in 2.6, anything that was marked as deprecated for removal in 2.4 is now gone out of this release. So that means if there are any classes, methods, and properties that have been deprecated in 2.4, please make sure you are not calling any of these. So that's your first kind of step in upgrading, is make sure you're not using any of those deprecated features. something else I kind of want to touch on, and that is Spring Boot releases. So this is probably a good point to talk about that we release a new version of Spring Boot every 6 months or so. We release a new patch version of Spring Boot every month or so. So Spring 2.6 was released back in November. So we're kind of just getting around to kind of talking about this. Again, I'm a month in, so this is my chance to kind of catch up on some of this and explain some of the new features in 2.6. 2.6.4, which is a patch version, will be released tomorrow. And this is a good time just to talk about, let me see. Sorry, just wanted to say hi, Romania here. No problem at all. I'm completely fine with people popping in and out. I know people got to work. I'm just kind of here hacking some code. So anybody who wants to show up and go, completely fine. Let's talk about milestones. So let me open this. And again, if you go to github.com/spring projects, so under Spring projects, you can get to things like Spring Framework or Spring Boot. If you look at the milestones, you can kind of see what is planned. So you'll see the 3.0. So we've planned 3.0 for later this year. The milestone 2 is due by March 24th, and that is kind of 61% complete. And again, you can look at all the different versions that we have here. You can also go into something like tags, and tags will show you kind of which releases have been tagged. Then there's releases. And one thing I want to point out, if we don't remember, if we kind of go back to like the 2.4, 2.3 days, you have this dot release on it. So as 2.4 came out, we've moved to we've dropped the release suffix. So that was kind of from a prior naming schema. We've since dropped that. So any of the versions that we're working with now, you'll see just like the actual version on there. So unless it's like this one, like a milestone. So we have, 2.6.3. So that's just a quick mention about the releases. There's also this handy little calendar that is public. So if you go to calendar.spring.io, you will see all of the releases. So here we are in February. Today is the 23rd. As I mentioned, tomorrow, the 24th, we do have some releases coming out. So we have 2.6.4, 2.5.10, and 2.7.0 milestone 2. So this is a good thing just to kind of look at and take a look at, what's upcoming, what's coming up this month, and we can even jump ahead, start to see some other things that are going on. So remember earlier I said Spring Boot 3.0.0 milestone 2 comes out in March. We see that on the calendar. So just something else to think about. I really want to start out with just kind of talking about deprecated features and release versions. Okay, from there, we're actually going to get into code. So let me see if I don't like this background, but let me see. Let's maybe do something like this. Yeah, that looks a little better. We'll see if it works when I'm actually coding. So I'm going to create a new project. Let's see if I have, pretty sure I have a live streams. Let's start there. And we'll call this Blogger. So again, this is just going to be a simple demo application. We're just going to build out some features using 2.5.9. We'll look at that in a second. And we're going to take a look at, we're kind of going to build an application before 2.6. And we're going to build it in a way that some things might not make a lot of sense, but that's okay. We kind of want to show off some of the new features at 2.6. And so some of the things I'm going to build may seem quirky at first, but I'm sure, as we get to them, they'll make a little bit more sense. So again, I want to make sure I'm on 2.5.9. Again, if you're not sure what versions are out there and they're not in this drop-down list, you can always head over to GitHub, as I showed you before, and look at the slash releases or slash tags and get an idea of what versions are around. So for this, we're going to create a new project with just the web and actuator. And that's all we need. And we'll get finished. Okay, and one thing I like to do whenever I create a new project is just go ahead and run it, just to make sure nothing crazy happened, and it seems like we're okay there. So the first thing we need to talk about is circular references. I'm at 2.6.2, I think. Yeah, you're caught up then. I mean, 2.6.3 is the latest, but you're really close. So I don't think you're missing anything major there. Okay, so I want to talk about circular references. So let's create a new package, and we're going to call this service. And inside a service, I'm going to go ahead and create a post service, and I'm going to create a new comment service. So I basically have two services, and I don't want to do anything just yet. I want to start by talking about, let's take Spring out of the equation. So we have these two services. Post service needs some features of comment service, and comment service may need some features in post service. So what you might end up doing is creating a constructor and being able to inject that class in via dependency injection. And so let's take a look at what that might look like. Let's do this kind of without Spring first, right? So let's say that I have well, I guess this would kind of include Spring, but let's do this without actually setting up any constructor injection. So let's just say that I had a post service and I wanted to create a new post service. And let's say I had a comment service and I wanted to create a comment service. What if, now we haven't set these constructors up yet, but what we're going to end up trying to do here is I want to pass in comment service and I want to pass in post service. At this point, the post service will have been instantiated, so this one will probably get satisfied. But at this point, this one will not. So let's talk about that. So what we might do in an application here is say private final comment service, and IntelliJ is going to help us out here and add a constructor for that. So this is using Spring's dependency injection here if the comment service was found. So, and what I mean by that is we said, hey, Spring, go ahead and manage this for us. So now this will get auto-wired in because in Spring Framework 5.4.3, if there, whatever version that was, if there's a single constructor, you don't need to annotate it with @autowire. So at this point, this should work. Now let's go ahead and say that this is also a service. And we would do the same thing in here. So private final post service. Spring is again saying, okay, let's make that a constructor injection. So we've kind of simulated what I did here, right? We have a post service that accepts a comment service. We have a comment service that accepts a post service. And if you take Spring out of the equation, you can kind of look at this and see why this is never going to work, right? How do I get an instance of comment service if I haven't created it yet, right? So let's just go ahead and try and start this up and see what's going on. So we'll get this failure and it will say the dependencies of some of the beans in the application context from a cycle. So comment service, post service. So these are basically in a circular reference, and this is a no-no, right? We'll talk about it later, but when we get to 2.6.3, there are these really nice failure analyzers in Spring Boot. So we'll show those off a little later. Okay, so 2.5.9, how can we fix this? Before 2.6, right? Well, and even afterwards in 2.6, this particular way is not going to work. So one is you could say that, okay, I need a different way of getting the comment service in here. One way is you could maybe set some setter injection. So again, if you were to create a post service and just create a new instance of it and then create a comment service that took a post service, right? And then on the post service, you did something like that where you set a comment service that would work outside of Spring, right? So that'll work inside of Spring too. So you can move to maybe setter dependency injection, setter injection there in the post service. Something else you can also do is here in the post service, you can mark this with @lazy. And if we take a look at that, so this indicates whether a bean is to be lazily initialized. So if we go through this, you basically see that this is, in addition to component initialization, this annotation may be placed on injection points marked with inject. In that context, it's something different. But again, this annotation should solve our circular reference problem here because it's basically saying, hey, I don't need you to satisfy this dependency at startup. You can go ahead and take care of that later. So that's one way. Now, what you're going to see here is there is, let's do this and this. You might see a lot of this happening. So here and here, it's final, and we can make this final. So now we've done the same thing, right? We kind of have this circular reference. But we're no longer using constructor injection. We're using field injection. And if you hover over this, field injection is not recommended. Thank you, IntelliJ, for fighting the good fight. But you will see this in a lot of applications. So let's go ahead and start this up. So this runs. And this in particular is what we're trying to avoid. Again, we often recommend constructor injection for a few reasons, right? So let's take a look. Okay, so we're in a post service. Here's the comment service. So what happens when you mark a class or mark this field as @autowired? there's a bunch of things happening and they're not all good things. So you'll see in the, let me just pull up in the documentation. There's a good little blurb about this. So let's go over here. And I thought I had the right link. So the Spring team generally advocates constructor injection as it lets you implement application components as immutable objects and ensures the required dependencies are not null. So that's the first thing. So we want to ensure that that these application components are immutable. So if we go back to our project here, you'll see that we had to take out that final keyword. That's because it can't be final, because after the application is started up, that's when these properties get injected into each of the components. So that auto wiring is happening afterwards. So that's the first thing. And again, it's happening through reflection. So we've marked this as a private, but somehow the application is injecting this into our class. So this isn't following the normal rules of a class. When we say this property is, or this field is private, we don't want anybody from the outside accessing it. Yet here we are, and Spring is able to circumvent that because of reflection. And not just Spring, Java in general, right? So that already feels kind of icky. Like we've marked this as private. I don't want anybody else to go ahead and inject this. So it's private, it's not final. What happens if comment service has some database calls in it? And we don't want to make those database calls in a test, right? So we may mock this out in a test, and there are ways to do this, but if anybody ever wants to create an instance of post service on their own, they're going to have to use reflection to get that comment service in there. So again, just a whole bunch of things happening that don't feel natural. When you use constructor injection, you know that when that component is initialized, that property is going to be available for use. You don't have to mess around with any kind of post constructs. So there's just a whole bunch of advantages to using constructor injection. So we're going to leave this like this and kind of move on. I'm going to go through a lot of the 2.59 stuff, and then what we'll do is we'll create a branch of this. We'll switch over to a new branch and upgrade to 2.6, and we'll look at how we can fix this. So that was one thing. And again, we'll come back to that. Any questions so far on circular references, why constructor injection is preferred? I really want to get to, I've gotten a lot of questions lately on kind of best practices on things, especially in my last live stream with IntelliJ. We're working on some plans to try and get something up and running for some type of office hours where some people can ask questions, and then we can always refer back to those. One of those questions I get asked all the time is like, why should I be using constructor injection? That nobody wants to just take the word of anybody else. They want to really understand it. And so those are one of those questions I want to be able to like answer in full and just kind of point back to all the time. All right, no questions. So the next thing I want to talk about is the path matching strategy in Spring MVC. So let's come in here. We're going to create a new package. We'll call this controller. In here, we'll create a new class, and we'll call this, say, post controller. We'll say this is going to be a REST controller. And I'm going to create a new Git mapping. Again, this is going to be a little funky, but just bear with me. So if I was trying to get posts by name and name, this is actually allowed. So we have a Git mapping here in a controller. The path that we're trying to match is /posts/name/name. But you'll see here that our path variable, we're just assigning a single path variable to a string type with the variable name of name. Even though there's two, which one kind of wins out, right? So let's test this. We're going to run this. And I'm going to use IntelliJ's HTTP client. And so this is localhost 8080/posts/name and name. So I'm going to say that this is going to be my last name and then my first name. And if we go ahead and run this and we look in the console, we see the name is Dan. So when we declared it twice, the last one out actually won. And so the default strategy for matching request paths against Spring MVC handler mappings in 2.5.9 is using something called the ANT path matcher. What we'll do is we'll upgrade this when we get to 2.6, and we'll see that the default version of how we match paths in Spring MVC has changed. And it's going to fix this, which to me, this is kind of a bug anyways. So not really changing something. It's really fixing a bug, if you ask me in this case. So we'll get to that. The next thing is, if you didn't know, if you come into resources, application.properties, we can go ahead and set some things. So I'm going to set the Spring application.name. We'll call this blogger. And we can use, so this is actuator, the info contributor. So if we look for info contributor, there is this class, this functional interface that allows to basically contribute properties to the info actuator endpoint. And so what that means is we can say things like info and then anything we add on to it. So if we want to do app name, we can actually reference something else here. Then we can just add some properties. We go ahead and just copy and paste some so we don't have to watch me type. And so this is an API version, maybe the docs, maybe the department email. And this could become very handy in situations where you have many microservices or many services in a larger organization. You may be talking to other services in the case of kind of a project I was on not too long ago. Many microservices, and when you're calling them, you may not know like who is, if the documentation isn't up to date, who's the owner of that service? Where can I find out more about this service? Who can I contact if I'm having issues? This is just one example, but the example of being able to add anything on to this environment right on the info actuator, you can do this in 2.5.9. So let's go ahead and restart this. And if I go back over here and I go localhost 8080 actuator, we actually didn't enable all of them. So let's say management dot include management dot endpoints web dot exposure include just all of them for now. Okay, so now if we go over to info, you can see that we have more information on this endpoint. Seems like I missed the last Spring Boot version. Oh, that's all right. Again, we're on 2.6.3, I believe is the latest version. No big deal. So here we are able to see, let me bump that up a little. So now we have all of that extra information on the actuator endpoint for info. So again, if other teams are able to browse this information within your organization, this may be a place where you can kind of add some extra metadata. So again, this was something we can do in 2.5.9. We've changed a little something on this in 2.6, which we'll get to when we kind of update this. Any questions so far? All right. Next thing I want to look at is, before we look at what's kind of changing, this is a feature that everyone may not know exists yet. This is new in 2.4, and then we'll talk about what's changed in 2.6 in a little bit. But for those of you who don't know, Spring Application.run is really just a shorthand for new Spring Application logger application.class and then .run with the args, right? So one thing that came out in 2.4, let's go ahead and introduce a variable. Again, you don't need to do this if you don't need to change anything about the application. You can just keep it like this. But the second you need to kind of customize the application, you'll want to do something like this. So now what we can do is we've added the ability. So let's kind of back up for a second. If you've ever tried to profile a Spring application, you might find it quite difficult because you end up in the same create bean method, and it's really hard to tell where the actual problems are. And so there's a new interface that allows you to get much more detailed information about your application as it starts. And the way that we can do this is by setting, there's a set application startup. And again, there is a application startup interface. So if we look at this, there's really not much to this. There's a start method and there's a startup step. So there's a series of steps that can happen. So there's two implementations of this interface in 2.4. Again, this came out in 2.4. There's one for the flight recorder. So flight recorder application startup. And then there's also a buffering application startup. This actually takes a new instance of this, and this actually takes in the number of the amount you want to store. So I just put in a big number for now, just because we're just demoing it. So this will now allow us to get a lot more information about the application. So if we go ahead and restart this, and we go back to the actuator. Oh, do we not like that? Oh, we should probably actually run it, right? Let's do that. Cool. So now if we go back to the application and go to the actuator, there is now going to be another endpoint here called startup. Now, again, if you don't customize the Spring application and use one of those implementations, or your own for that matter, again, there's the application startup interface. You can completely use your own implementation if you wanted to. But if you don't use any of those, then this endpoint is not available. So again, I've also exposed every endpoint. So if you're not doing it that way, and you probably shouldn't, if you're going into production, you should probably expose the the only endpoints that you want to expose. If this is one of those that you want to expose, make sure you include that in that list. This is the startup endpoint. So if we go into startup, you'll see we have some information about the application. Mainly things like start time, end time, duration. And there's a bunch of information on here. We'll talk about more again, what's changed in 2.6.3 when we get to that application. I just wanted to kind of do this as a reminder to anyone who didn't know that it was there, that you can do this since 2.4. So that's the application startup. Okay, one more, and then we'll upgrade our application and we'll have some fun with it. So one more that I might do here is I want to create a new package, and we'll call this model. Actually, yeah, actually, I don't care if it's in here. That's fine. I'm going to create a new class, and we'll call this author properties. So this is going to be a properties class. We want the author of the blog to go ahead and be able to set up some of their properties in the, via configuration. So we might start with an at configuration properties. We may give it a key of blogger.author. And IntelliJ is saying, hey, Spring Boot configuration annotation processor is not configured. That's okay. If we open up the documentation, it will give us the dependency that we need. We can go back to our pom.xml and we can go ahead and add this and refresh, reload our Maven changes. And now everything should be okay. Now this is going to tell us that we haven't enabled configuration properties yet. So if we go back to our Blogger application, we can go ahead and enable configuration properties. And specifically, we can do it for just this class. So far, so good. Again, this is nothing new. I'm just kind of talking through a few things, and then we'll look at it. So we might have a private string first name, private string last name, private string email, and we might mark these to just help someone out. Say, oops, say the first name of the author. Okay. So let's go ahead and rerun that. Now, if we actually didn't need to rerun that, I'm coming over here. Now, if I wanted to, I can come into application.properties and define the author information. So I can say blogger dot, which way did we go? Blogger dot author dot first. What do we say? Configuration properties, blogger dot author. Right. Spencer wanted to point out that @lazy creates a proxy. Good point, Spencer. Didn't think about that. So yeah, so in that other scenario, setting up a setter injection for one of those is probably the best route. Okay, back in my let me just do this. I don't know why I'm not getting so at configuration properties blogger.author. We have this might help. So I probably need to set up some getters and setters. That's probably why I'm not getting any assistance. Okay, so now that I have getters and setters, I should be able to come in here and say blogger dot and there we go. Okay, so now we could say blogger dot author dot first name equals Dan, blogger equals Vega. Cool. So I don't know why I can't see the bottom ones. Can you take this from Palm? Take what? Take the properties? I'm not sure you'd want to do that. So this way we're kind of making it configuration. So again, we're just creating in this case, a class marked with @configuration properties, and now we can configure that in any property source, right? For this particular case where you're just defining a first name, last name, and an email of an author, not that big of a deal. But when you want property sources to be able to be overridden or maybe even reloaded on the fly, it's important to kind of extract these properties into configuration properties. But what I wanted to show here is, okay, this works in 2.5.9, but what I want to do is change this. So there's actually a much better way to represent this. This is very verbose. So what if I wanted to say this was a record? So records as of Java 16, right? And I wanted to say first name, string last name, string no. So that is a record. Now this is not going to work if I'm going to try to kick something off here and see if it will yell at us. Cool. So what it's telling us here is the parameter 0 of constructor is required for a required of type string could not be found. So the biggest thing here now is that we don't have getters and setters. So if you're kind of new to records, let's take a look at basically what it creates for us. So if you look at the class for author properties, a record is a new type and it creates kind of an immutable object. And what that does is the only way to create a new instance of that object is through the constructor. And then there's getters for each of those properties. And so if you're doing that, now Spring is trying to say, hey, you have this configuration property. I'm trying to set this. How do I do that? There's no setter. I need to do that some way. And so one way that you can do that now is using, well, not now, in 2.5.9 is by saying, hey, constructor binding. And this annotation can be used to indicate that the configuration properties should be bound using constructor arguments rather than by calling setters. Because again, there are no setters here, right? So now this fixes everything. And again, if we run this again, This should work. Getters and setters. Yep, just totally missed it. Started off with a blank class and totally forgot about them. I've been writing a lot more records lately, so I'm gonna blame that. Where I just haven't been writing getters and setters a lot, so that's been nice. Okay, so those are all of the things in kind of 2.5.9 land that I wanted to talk about. So what I want to do then is let's come over here and live stream. What do I want to do here? I have not done anything with this yet. We want to do, what do I want to do here? I want to, yes, I want to create a new repository. Yes, so let's actually just do this. So here in IntelliJ, I'm going to go to VCS. I'm going to say, let's create a Git repository for this blogger. That should be my stream blogger. So we're going to create a repository. We're going to go ahead and say this is the 2.5.9. Okay, we're going to commit and push. Going to define a remote. Oh no, we need to. So I'm trying to do everything in IntelliJ these days. I'm used to the command line, but IntelliJ can like do everything. I've been noticing that I like with the HTTP client, I can stay in IntelliJ. With things like the terminal, I can stay in IntelliJ. So the more I can stay in IntelliJ, the more I get outside of here, I am a little bit more focused. So I want to share this project on GitHub, and we're going to call this all right. So let's share that. Okay. Agreed. We're going to need a README at some point. We'll come back to that. So yeah, we should have. Okay. So now what I want to do is create a new branch. Call this 2.5.9 work. And now what I'll do is come back to my master branch and check that out. Actually, one more thing. Let's go back to 2.5.9. No, we don't have anything there. So push. All right, and then back to our master branch. Thank you and thank you. And we come here. We have 2.5.9 mark. Okay, so that'll be good enough to, I just want to make sure people have a branch to go off of to kind of see what we did before 2.5.9. And okay, so we are about an hour in, right on. Okay, so let's go ahead and update our application now. So we're going to come over to our Palm. Again, I know that the most recent version is 2.6.3. You'll see I can kind of get some hints here too. So if I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to save that, reload my Maven changes. And we're going to go through these in the order that I kind of talked about them before. So the first thing we talked about is our circular references. So in our service, we had a comment service and a post service, and they both used field injection. And we were able to run our application in 2.5.9. If we run our application now, we get some warnings here. And it's basically going to not allow us to do this. So it's going to say, hey, the same message that we saw before. There's a circular reference going on. Replying upon circular references is discouraged, and they are prohibited by default. Now, we're kind of trying to, again, encourage constructor injection here. But if you have a large application you're trying to update, and you have a lot of this in place, and you don't want to take the time, invest the time to go through and kind of fix all of those things, we do have a last resort here, and that is you could set spring.main.allow circular references to true. So let's go back to our application.properties. We can come in here and set this equal to true. And if we go ahead and run this, did I not set the right one? Spring main dot allow circular references is the right one, right? Let's try and run that again. Okay, so now a completely different error message. So again, you could do this, but we do want to kind of shy away from this, right? So let's go ahead and fix these ourselves. So again, back in post service, I want to create a private final comment service, and I'm going to add a constructor parameter. And then in comment service, again, I'm thinking of, okay, if I create a post service, I want to get an instance, the first thing I would create is a post service, and then I'd get a comment service. So in this case, I'm going to actually shy away from this, and we're going to say create public set comment service. Okay. And now again, that in a second, say auto wired, tell us that can't be final. And this is going to tell us that we need to return void. So now in this case, now we have a post service. It has a common service in here, but it's going to use a setter injection. We have a common service that has takes in a post service through constructor injection. So now if we go ahead and run our application. By the way, those little gray hints that you're seeing, that should not cause a circular reference. If I'm, I thought that would fix that. Because this would happen, I guess we don't know if that is, I would think that would work. Let me look into that. And just use constructor injection. And as Spencer said, this is going to create a proxy. Run that. Okay, so back to the other error messages. I need to look into that, figure out what is causing that. But okay. What was I trying to talk about? I don't know. I forgot what I was trying to say there. No big deal. Okay. So we've taken care of one of those issues. The second issue that we need to take care of is back in our controller, in the post controller, is we have this /post/name/name, and this was working in 2.5.9. It's not working in 2.6. And you'll see here it says fix this pattern in your application or switch to the legacy parser implementation with this particular property. So as I mentioned before, we've changed the default matching strategy from the ant path matcher to a path pattern parser. So this is going to be wherever you're looking for paths in Spring MVC. So whether this is in a controller, you're also going to have this in any Spring security settings. So if you have like an authorized request that MVC matchers, the important thing to note is the ant path matcher was much more lenient. You see that it let this through. The new path pattern parser is not as lenient, and you can see this already. It's saying, hey, you've got this double name going on, this property name twice, and I don't like that. So it's much more strict about those things. But again, to me, that's just fixing a bug. Like you shouldn't have this twice, right? You should have, this should say last name, first name, and then you can say, all right, I want to get my last name. And then I also want to get path variable, string, and first name, right? So now we can say last name, and then first name. So now if you wanted to circumvent this and stick with the old behavior because you're upgrading an application and maybe you had a bunch of instances where this was failing and causing a bunch of issues, then you could use this property here in your properties file and it would turn it back to the old ant path matcher. But if you can, we kind of encourage you to go ahead and just fix the places that are the problems and continue and to use the new mechanism for dealing with paths. And the reason for that is it's much more performant and it's, and for that reason alone, it's really the recommended choice. So now that we fixed that, if we go ahead and run, let's see, our application starts up okay. So that was two of them. The next thing is, okay, our application started. I want to go back to the actuator. I'm going to reload this, and I'm going to go back to that info point. And if you look in here in this info point, we don't have any of that info that we were showing before. Remember, we set up like an app name, an API version, the docs, the department name, the department detail. And let's talk about why we're not seeing that here. So the Spring team took a look at this and decided that this is potentially a security risk by having any key that starts with the info from any property source end up in your actuator endpoint. So we decided to make it more of an opt-in. So think about this, even in your environment, if you had, say, --info.department emoji is equal to, and we can throw in an emoji here. Even if you had this as a command line argument, this is a different property source. In previous versions, this would show up, and this may not always be the desired outcome. So to get these to show up, you need to come into your properties, and you need to say management.info environment enabled and set that to true. So now if we go ahead and reload this, we can see all of the properties from both our properties file and even another property source like the command line arguments. That one's showing up right here. They're all able to come through again. I showed you that application startup earlier. So if we go into this, so this again was a 2.4 thing. What is changed in 2.6 is if we go into the startup, what has changed is there was a spring.boot.application running step, and that's been renamed to spring.boot.application.ready. So if we search in here for ready, you see that step is here. So whether you're using the flight recorder application startup or the buffering application startup, that is now been changed to this property name, spring.boot.application.ready. Small change, just wanted to kind of note it and give me a good chance to kind of talk about the application startup in case you weren't familiar with it. Okay, the last of kind of the upgrading properties was our record. So if we go into model and author properties, you remember we had this act configuration properties, and we had to add this act constructor binding annotation on here, which seems kind of redundant, right? Like there is no other way that I'm going to be able to use a record. A record has a constructor that takes in all of the properties, and it has getters. It doesn't have setters, so there's no other way to populate this record. And so in 2.6.3, you can simply remove this, just kind of happens for us, and we no longer need that, and it just kind of simplifies our code. So that is all I had for upgrading from 2.5. So let's create a new branch here. And I'm going to check out master again. All right, any questions in the chat? How's everyone doing? We sticking around? Okay. So those are, again, those are, if you're looking at the release notes, these are the ones where if you're upgrading from a previous version like 2.5, these are all the things to think about. So we talked about circular references, path pattern based path matching strategy, our actuator environment info contributor that is disabled by default. That one property in the application startup got renamed. And then there's a couple other things. Things like dependency management. So there are dependency, yes, that, not going to talk about that. There's our records one, something about Maven's build info. So that's really all I cover in the upgrading path. So now we're going to talk about some new and noteworthy things that are going on. So in my presentation, I will talk about dependency upgrades. You can read through the release notes. Some of the big ones are Spring Security 5.6, Spring Data 2021.1. And if you're not aware, some of the Spring projects follow a calendar year release. So like that's why Spring Data is 2021.1. So you'll see that in some of the Spring projects. And then a bunch of third-party dependencies, but we got things like Apache Kafka is 3.0. Hibernate moves to 5.6. Jane and Jupyter moves to 5.8. So if you haven't had a chance, and I am on this list of, I need to catch up on JUnit. I don't feel like I've taken advantage of a lot of the 5.x features, and now we're moving up to 5.8. So a lot of features to catch up on there, and I'm looking forward to that. So things like Mockito 4.0, Micrometer 1.8, Kotlin 1.6, Postgres 42.3, and a whole bunch of others. Again, I'm going through some things here in the release notes that I have slides for later, but that's okay. The reactive server session properties. So if you've used these before, it was previously under spring.webflux.session. So these are going to align with the servlet version. So you'll have a server.reactive.session. Again, just to kind of align with the servlet versions of that. But let's talk about same site cookie attribute. Before we write some code, let's put this over here now. And we don't need that. We don't need that. And we don't need that. I want to open up. So there is a link here. I have a couple good resources for this. There's a couple good videos on YouTube if you don't understand what it is. I understand this at a top level from a browser standpoint. I don't fully. I haven't played around and actually got this to like wrote a that tested some of this stuff out. But again, this has to do with a cookie attribute called same site, and this has been out for a long time now. But in newer versions of browsers, they've really started to enforce this, and I say newer, I mean this is last year. But what you want to pay attention to is you need to understand cross-site and same-site cookie context. And if the domain associated with a cookie matches an external service and not the website and the user's address bar, this is considered a cross-site or a third-party cookie. So there's third-party cookies and first-party cookies, which is the same site. That's really all it is. Same site or third party. Which cookie is this coming from? And I'll let you kind of read through this. I'm not going to bore you with the kind of underlying pinnings of what the browser's doing. But what we care about is being able to set this attribute on within our Spring Boot applications, right? So let's do this. Let's go ahead and we're going to create a new controller, and we'll call this session controller. And what we'll do is I will go ahead and create a get mapping. We'll say that every time you hit the home endpoint, we're going to return the response body. So we are going to get access to the HTTP session, the HTTP servlet response. And then in here, let's do a couple things. So we're going to get a value from the session, get an attribute called name. Again, we're just setting up, we're grabbing some information out of the session here. We're going to say if the value is equal to null, go ahead and set the value equal to string that value of, let's say instant.now. Okay. We're also going to set that attribute, so name value. And so that is from the session standpoint. So we're gonna try and get a value out of the session if it exists. If it doesn't, we're gonna get we're basically gonna set the value equal to now, so instant.now, and then we're gonna set that session attribute. So the my attribute is going to be equal to this value. So that will produce one cookie because there's going to be the J session ID that the servlet needs to keep track of that. Then we're going to go ahead and add a response. We're going to create a new cookie. So we're going to add a cookie, and we're going to say new cookie, and we'll call this one my cookie, and we'll go ahead and stick the value in there as well. So that's not imported. And then finally, we're just going to return the value so we can display it on the page as we take a look at it. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, if we come back here and we go to /home, that's not what I set it up to. I should probably mark this with controller. Okay, so there's our time. But now let's go ahead and inspect this and go under application and look at cookies. And so let's take a look at a couple things here. So we see this J session ID. So this is allowing us to get and set attributes in the session. You'll see this same site and secure. So we see these are all empty here. And then the same goes for my cookie. We see same site and secure is empty. We do see some other cookies in here. This one is set to Lex. I don't know what I'm even using those for, so let's just remove those. And okay. So now, if you need to restrict this to be secure so that only cookies from first party context can access that, then we need to set this this same site attribute to strict. If we don't set it to anything, the default, I believe, is lax. So if you have cookies, you might consider using a separate cookie to get the security benefit of same site equals lax. I believe that it's lax, although if you don't, I think the one thing that kind of trips everybody up, and again, if you're in the comments and you know more about this than I do, which is probably all of you, tell me otherwise. I believe the default is lax, but it just doesn't display lax. And I think that's what trips everybody up about this. Let me jump over to Mozilla and see if I can find anything there. So this feature is available only in secure context. The same site attribute of setCookie allows you to declare your cookie should be restricted to first party or same site context. So standards related to the cookie same site attribute change that the cookie sending behavior, if same site is not specified as same site lax. Previously, the default was that cookies were sent for all requests. So in most browsers, I think the default was, hey, we're just going to send the cookies. This is going to help with, cross-site request forgery attempts. So now cookies with same site equals none must now also specify the secure attribute. So the only way that you could say none on the same site is if you also have it as secure. But again, cookies are not sent on a normal cross-site sub request. So by default, I believe this is, see the same site defaults to lax. So note, lax replaced none as the default. In order to ensure that users have reasonably robust defense against some classes of cross-site request forgery attacks. So lax has replaced none, even if it doesn't say that when you're looking at the cookie. So if we want to make that change, this is what we're here to talk about today. So there is no attribute to this cookie for same site. And then the question becomes, well, how do we change this? So if you're kind of catching up on some of this stuff, cookie is in the javax.servlet.http package. So this was all donated to the Eclipse Foundation. And because of that, these APIs are not evolving. And so as we move towards Spring Boot 3.0 and Spring Framework 6 for that matter, we are moving to the Jakarta EE packages. And with that, the APIs will evolve. But until then, we need a way to still kind of evolve our applications, right? The problem with that now is that each of the underlying servlet containers will need to kind of create their own implementation of that. And so we have to find a way to find common ground there and make it easy for us to do it here in a Spring application. So we do have a solution for this, and let's take a look at that. Just looking to see if we have any questions. I know this might be a little bit off, but so what we can do is we can create a new bean here, and this is going to be public of cookie same site supplier. And now what we can do is we can use the we can go ahead and set so we have these static methods here. So of strict, so I can say, hey, I want this of strict. And let's actually go back here. I just want to see what this is. Even though we don't have any same site there, let's just go ahead and set this to of lax. And let's go ahead and run this again. I just want to see this in action. All right, so now if we run this, It's basically saying for any cookie, I want you to go ahead and set this as lax, right? Now, if we want to get very specific about this, we can say, okay, uh, for I want to set it of strict, and then I want to go ahead and refine that to just a specific cookie. We can say when has name. And so we can say when my cookie is there, I want you to go ahead and set that to same site strict. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And now you'll see this one is strict. So that's really it. Just we didn't have the ability in 2.5, before 2.6 to be able to set that same site attribute on a cookie. And now we do. Now, again, this may not be the cleanest way or the easiest. I mean, it's not that hard. So I won't say it's not easy. But this seems like something I would really want to do here. I would want to say here, hey, this cookie, we should go ahead and set this to strict and secure. But we can't do this here. Hopefully we can do this as we march towards Spring Boot 3.0. Any questions on same site cookie? Okay. Just going to run through a couple more things. Let's talk about sanitization. So let's go to run and edit configurations. And let's go here and I'm going to add some command line arguments. Fine, okay, and we're going to rerun this. And we're going to go back here and go to the actuator. Care about this anymore. Now, if we look for config props, so config props will kind of show us all the property sources. And one of those property sources that we have, oh, I don't want to be here. I want it to be, yeah, I did. Yeah, so there's the web points. Sorry about this, 1 second. I don't want to be in environment, right? Sorry, I don't know why I was going to config props. Oh, that's because, right, the sanitizer works for both env and config props. All right, so let's just talk about sanitization first. And if you look at, now remember, go back here, we set very.secret equal to password and very.other equal to key. Again, those are command line arguments. Here's a property source for command line arguments. You'll see that very.other key came through fine, but very.secret, we didn't expose that through our actuator endpoint here. And it got replaced with these asterisks. And again, this is our sanitization at work. And so if we go ahead and look at sanitizer. So the way that this works is it looks for a bunch of things like password, secret, key. So secret was one of those. Token, anything credentials, any of these, it will go ahead and sanitize. So if we wanted to add another one here, let's say, apply. Okay, and restart this. And we refresh this, you'll see that token also got sanitized. So we have some default sanitizers. Again, this is doing this right out of the box for us. But we have now got the ability to write our own sanitizing functions. And check here, looking. Oops. Sorry, 1 second. Just looking. Okay. So where was I? Okay, cookie seems that's clear. So what if we want to write our own sanitizing function? Well, we can in Spring Boot 2.6. So we're going to start with a bean. It's going to return a sanitizing function. And we'll call it sanitizing function. So it's going to return a new sanitizing function. So we'll clean this up in a second. It is probably going to already start telling us, hey, you can return a lambda. But let's just take a look at this for a second. So this is a sanitizing function. It's a functional interface. So again, we can use a lambda here. The apply method takes in sanitizable data. So sanitizable data basically says, hey, here's the sanitized value. Here's the default, right? What is the we're going to get the value, the sanitized value. We're going to get the property source, the key, and the value. So one instance where we can use this is if we wanted to sanitize, say, all incoming command line arguments. Because again, we get that property source. Command line arguments is one of those property sources, right? So one thing we can do, we can say, hey, if the data coming in, if the property source and the name is equal to command line property source dot command line property source. So if the data that's coming in is coming from a command line source, let's go ahead and return data with value. And we can, this is basically our sanitizing function. So what are we going to replace that with? This is top secret. And then if we don't return that, we're just going to return the data. So yeah, again, we can clean this up, but let's just leave this for now. So just to kind of go back over this, we've created a bean that's going to return a sanitizing function. That sanitizing function has a single method called apply. It's going to take in this data. From that data, we can get the property source. So we're saying basically anything that comes from the command line, I want you to go ahead and replace with this is top secret. So let's go ahead and refresh this and go back to our environment. And now you can see very.other got replaced with this is top secret. Now these are still being replaced by the default sanitizer, and this sanitizer is coming from us. So this is really just in case, hey, the default sanitizer that we provide out of the box, if this isn't meeting your needs and there are other things that you need to go ahead and sanitize, or there are whole collections of things you need to sanitize, then you can do so. So you basically, again, have access to the property source, the key, and the value. So you can key off of any of those. So if the key starts with logger.author. We had those before. If we don't want those to show up in our in an actuator endpoint there, we can go ahead and check for those type of keys too. So that is a sanitizing function. I'm going to go back to my application.properties. And something else I want to enable is management.info.java.enabled, and we'll enable that to true. And with that, I'm going to go back to my actuator endpoints. And I'm going to go to info. And now I see I have some more information here about which version of Java I'm using. So I'm using the Oracle JDK version 17, and then just some more information about that particular version. And this is really helpful in certain situations where you don't have access to the environment, say in a cloud environment, just to be able to have some information returned to you on what version of Java we're using. So that is the Java runtime information. Again, that's exposed on the info endpoint, but you do have to opt into that. It's not going to be there by default. I do want to talk about that. We're going to talk about some metric support in a second, but I want to take a look at one more change here. So we have this post controller, and let's just say that we had, let's say we had a get mapping for /posts, and this was, and we're going to return list of. Okay, so we have this method, and we want to write a test for this. So let's go ahead and generate a test class. So we're going to create a test, and we want to test for this. So we want to test find all. One of the things new in Spring 2.6 is the ability to use the web test client here in our tests. So previously, if you wanted to use the web test client in, say, a mock environment, Spring 5 something, 5.x added the ability, but you still had to like configure a new web test client using something like mock MVC web test client and bind to like the mock MVC. But now, as long as we're in a mock environment or class is annotated with the auto configure mock MVC, you will get an injected version of the web test client. And you're probably asking, what does this matter? But this helps if you want to kind of unify the way that you invoke all of your controller endpoints during tests. Maybe you have some WebFlux endpoints, maybe you have some MVC endpoints, and maybe you want to just kind of unify the way that you're kind of testing those endpoints. So let's take a look at this. You'll still need to come in here, and we'll need to add the dependency for WebFlux. So dependency, Spring Boot Starter, WebFlux, Spring Boot Starter, no help. I'm just gonna guess here then. I think this is it. So let's refresh those dependencies. So now if we go and do our post controller test, we're going to go ahead and do a web MVC test on just a post controller class. And again, in the past, you would have gotten mock MVC, maybe a REST template auto configured for you. But because this has an auto configure mock MVC on here, we are going to get an instance of the web test client. So we're going to say AutoWired. We're going to say web test client. test client, and now we have an instance of this. Again, if you've done this in a previous version, this was kind of a little bit of a pain to do. So I'm going to say web test client.get. What do I want to test here? So test get URI, say /posts. We are going to exchange. We are going to expect the status that is, no. Expect status. Thank you. That is okay. Not getting any help here, guys. And then I also want to expect the body, the JSON path. We want the size. Matches is should be 3, right? Yeah, 3. I think that should be it. So now we're using the web test client to just make a call out to our post controller at /posts. We want to make sure that we're getting a 200 back, and we want to say, hey, whatever that body is, I just want to make sure in that collection. So again, it's a list of strings. We just set 3 posts on there, and we want to make sure that the size is 3. So go ahead and run this. Yay, green, green, green. Cool. So I think that's it for this application. Let's go ahead and noteworthy. Oops. Push. Okay. So let's stop this. I'm going to open up another project. So I have the wonderful Spring Pet Clinic here. And there is only a couple changes to this. So this is the Spring Pet Clinic. You can download this. You can clone this over on GitHub. I've added a couple things to it. I've introduced, let's find it, Wavefront. So Wavefront Spring Boot Starter, Spring Cloud Starter Sleuth, and these are the 2 dependencies that I've added. So Wavefront is this really great tool for observability, collecting metrics. It does a whole bunch of things that I don't want to begin to talk about because I don't know enough about it yet. It is one of those things that is on my list to learn as I am starting here at VMware, because it does a whole lot of things. It does a whole lot of things that a whole lot of other tools do, and it kind of brings them all into one place. So if you ever use something like Grafana to build out dashboards, to be able to like collect all of this information about what your applications are doing, the state of your applications, Tanzu Wavefront is something similar to that. The good news is there's a free version, so it only keeps data up to 5 days. But again, if you're just kind of taking a look at it and trying to understand what it can do, that is perfect for you. So I've configured Wavefront. If you want to if you want to set up your own application, just come in here to start.spring.io, look for Wavefront, maybe add web to that, maybe add actuator, and you're ready to go. Download this, run it. Again, you get a freemium version, so you can get the kind of same metric. You can do a lot of the simple things that I'm going to do here today. So what I want to do is I want to start this application up. And it's started. And the one thing I'll look at is in application.properties for Wavefront. I've set up the application name and the application service. So this is the name of my application in Wavefront. This is the service in Wavefront. So you can basically have groups, and then the service is Spring Pet Clinic. Now you need to set up a Wavefront API token. And this is the first time you run it, that you'll get the API token and the URI. So this is where I want to go. And the API token that I've set up is actually in this secrets.properties. So something else that came in Spring 2.4, if you're not aware of, and honestly I wasn't, is the ability to set to import other configurations. So I'm saying spring.config.import. I'm setting this as optional, and I'm saying, hey, secrets.properties. And I love this because this reminds me, so if anybody's done work in kind of the JavaScript world, this reminds me of like .env. And so a .env on my local machine is, here are all the properties that I'm working with that I don't want to share with the outside world. And then I just git ignore this. So if you go into git ignore, you would see secrets.properties. And so now as I'm working on my local machine, I have the properties, the API token that I need to run Wavefront. As we push this up to somewhere else, or somebody else pulls this down to their machine, they will be able to, again, this is optional, so it's not going to fail if they don't have a secrets.properties, but it will fail if they don't set an API. So they'll just have to set that API token themselves. So I really like this approach. Really just kind of simplifies things for me. So let's go back over to the browser. And we're going to go to my dashboard here. And you can come in and see all your dashboards. You can like create charts and dashboards. Maybe I have something like this that has CPU utilization. I think these are just kind of demos. I had a test one that was pulling in some of those metrics. But if you go up to browse and you go to metrics, you can see all the different metrics that we're collecting. So we're collecting a lot of different metrics that we can go ahead. And then if you want to like look at the different ones here, then you could start to create your own dashboards and charts from these metrics. So the big changes here, we've added 2 new metrics related to application startup. So if you go into application, these are application.started and application.ready, and they're both times. So you can see the big difference here is that started is the time it takes to start the application, and ready is basically the time that it takes the application to be ready to service requests. So if we look at started, we can look at started time, and you can start to see earlier today, I was kind of firing this up, and you can see it a little bit over time. It's kind of gone up. Looks like 3.6. And these are, I believe, these are milliseconds. I'm not quite sure. So this is a line point. You can kind of switch between different graphs, right? Here's a plotted point. There's a stack column. So coming back to the metrics though, those are the 2 new ones under application. And then if you look under disk, Micrometer's disk space metrics are now auto-configured. So disk.free and disk.total metrics are provided for the partition identified by the current working directory. So you get those out of the box as well. So I don't know that I'm going to talk any more about VMware Tanzu observability from Wavefront, because it's one of those things that I've just gotten into, and I can't wait to dive into this more. Again, I've created a bunch of, we've created dashboards through different applications like Grafana before, and I'm kind of interested in jumping in here and seeing the different things that we can create for some applications here. Because again, I mean, it's great to get an application into production, but if you're not monitoring it and viewing performance and identifying bottlenecks, then you're missing out. You need to kind of understand what's happening in production and be able to react to anything that is going wrong. So this is one mechanism of doing that, and it's a big one. So look for more over the next couple months here on observability. It's something I'm very interested in and very interested in diving into. So I think that is it. That is all I really wanted to show. Let's go back to the release notes. So the new and noteworthy, we went through the same site cookie attribute. Oh, you know what? I didn't mention that. Okay, I should have mentioned that. So the way that we set it with a bean, you can also set just by setting this property. Let's say that we wanted to set everything to lax. You set this property. Now everything that gets set is by default going to be lax, which it is. Maybe you wanted to set it to none. So again, it's none, lax, and strict. But let's say you set everything to lax, and then you can use that bean to quantify or qualify which ones, like we did before with my cookie, we're setting that to strict. So there's some updated documentation on this. Yep. So of lax, when matching name is, and so you can use some wildcards in here, which is great. Programmatic customization. All right. Yeah, so I think that's it for that. We talked about the pluggable sanitization rules. This is what kind of threw me up before, is that it's for both env and config props. We were looking at env. Again, we returned a sanitizing function. So if you want, take a look at the GitHub repo for that. If you want info about the Java runtime environment, you can get that. This is in a slide, but we didn't talk about it here today. If you want to exclude specific properties from being added to the build info.properties that is generated by Spring Boot, Maven, or Gradle's plugin, you can exclude them. So let's say I wanted to exclude the version from getting generated there. I can go ahead and exclude that, and you can do it in both Maven and Gradle. I didn't get into health support. Honestly, I don't know much about this. I did not have time to get to this. So if I get some more information about this and understand this a little bit better, I will go ahead and share that with you. And then this is the metric support that we were talking about that we're actually logging now. So we can go ahead and get that information in something like Wavefront. I didn't get to Docker image building support either. There's just some additional things that you can do. So if you want like additional image tags, if you want to set the network configuration, cache configuration, you can do so. We talked about using the web test client for testing Spring MVC. That is really cool. Message source based. I did not get to this. This is pretty cool. I need to add this into my next presentation. This is something I saw that I'm pretty interested in, but I just don't do enough, SOAP testing or web services to have an example to show. But there's a new annotation. So we love our slice test, right? It basically allows us to not load the entire application context and just kind of focus in on the tests that we care about. So there's a new @web service server test, and that's used to test endpoints. And then based on that, it auto configures a mock web service client bean that can be used to test your web service endpoints. So if you're in that world of web services, this is great. You'll want to check that out. And then, we talked about some of the dependency upgrades. So then there's a bunch of miscellaneous ones. Yeah, I feel like we could probably make like a 2-hour video of everything in this talk. So I guess where I'm getting at is we'll go through a couple of these in a minute, but Spring Boot 2.6 was a pretty big release. There's a lot in here, but you wouldn't know it if you just kind of glanced at the release notes, right? Like, there's nothing that, like, if I'm just reading it, stands out there. It's like, wow, like that, I need that. But if you understand what it is, then you may say that, because, and again, I've been this way in the past where I just kind of glance through the release notes and go, all right, it's not 3.0. We're not moving to Java 17, so I'll move on. If you can start to dig through the release notes and understand kind of motivations behind each of the changes and the new features, and if you can do this for 2.6, 2.5, 2.4, I think you'll get a really good idea of what Spring is up to, or what Spring Boot is up to. A couple of these stood out to me. This is pretty cool. Spring Boot configuration processor can now generate metadata for classes annotated with Lombok's at value. So if you're a Lombok user, that will be interesting to you. Entity scan now supports comma separated values in the base packages attribute. That's nice. Custom. So this is a good one. I wish I had a example for this right now, but I don't. Jackson's default leniency can be configured using the spring.jackson.default leniency property. So this is basically a true false flag. And if you've ever created a local date or a local date time, let's say you create a property that is a local date time. If you try to just set a date on it, Jackson is pretty lenient and says, okay, I can set that property. I don't need a date and a time. A date will do just fine, and vice versa. If you set a time on it, okay, I can do that. If you want to be very strict about that, you can set this leniency to true. And now if you try to set just a date on a date time, it's going to throw an error. So that might be good. Disk-based metrics. The URLs of all available data sources is now logged when the H2 console is auto-configured. The URLs of all available data sources. I wonder, I don't quite understand that one, so I'll have to test that one out. Then again, I only ever have one data source, at least in my demos, so that's why I probably don't see that. And then if you're using Spring Security, auto configuration for the user detail service will now back off in the presence of an authentication manager provider being. And then deprecations in 2.6. Again, we talked about this kind of at the top of this show. Deprecations. So if we deprecate something in a version of Spring Boot, 2 versions later, it will now be removed. So anything that was deprecated in 2.4 has now been removed in Spring 2.6. These things that we're listing here that have now been deprecated in 2.6 will be removed 2 versions from now. So just important to remember. All right, so that is the 2.6 release notes. I've got a few things to update. I don't know how I'm going to get through all of this in 1 hour in a presentation tonight. I'm giving a presentation to San Francisco Java user group. I'm excited about that. And then once I'm done with that, we'll start to put some videos around this and get this out so that we can have more concise videos made for YouTube, kind of explaining some of the highlights here that we talked about today. And obviously, I need to go through and understand a few things a little bit better. And as soon as I do, I'll go ahead and share that with you guys. So if you have any about stuff that we covered here today, please reach out to me on Twitter at @TheRealDanVega. Find me at danvega.dev. All my information's there. Please reach out to me and let me know if you have any questions about this or anything else that you'd like to see me cover in previous ones. Like I said, one of my main goals now is to go back through the previous release notes and pay a lot more attention to them as I did with this one, because I just think it's a great learning experience. So if you want to take these and the docs and really focus on those and the guides, those are right now my 3 best free resources for learning Spring Boot. If you can kind of go through those, you're going to learn a lot. So, cool. All right. I think we'll call that a day. That is Tanzu TV code number 62. Thanks for joining us. Again, if you are new here, let's look at this real quick. That's the advocates page. This is Tanzu TV. There are so many great shows in here. I'm not saying this because I'm on this show. I'm saying this because before being here, I didn't know about all of the shows. So my friend Nate runs the Between Chair and a Keyboard podcast. I knew about that because I was lucky enough to be on it. But I didn't know about all these other shows. There's Tanzu Tuesdays. Enlightening with Whitney is just awesome. She does all these like lightboard examples and learns something new. That's a new show that's really cool. .NET in the Wild, .NET Beyond. We have our Spring One Tour recordings here. All of this is free content, so go ahead and check it out. This was code. We have a code every Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern. 12 p.m. Pacific. So go ahead and check this page out and see what we have upcoming. Again, thanks a lot for everyone that showed up. And thanks to you for watching the replay, if you're watching the replay. And as always, friends, happy coding.